Let's go ahead and get into the 5 things that your practitioner should have told you when they initially diagnosed you with type 2 diabetes. The first one is understanding the difference between type 1 diabetes and type 2 diabetes. Once again, so many times I've had patients come in and tell me that they're diabetic. And I'm saying, okay, you're type 2 diabetic. And they're saying, no, I'm type 1. Oh, wait, I think now I'm type 2. And the noun part, the transitioning from type 1 to type 2, when I hear that from a patient, I know that they don't really understand the difference between type 1 and type 2. And even if they don't make the mistake of, considering that they might be type 1 or type 2, or they're confused between the two cases, the fact that most people understand that type 1 diabetics have to depend on insulin for survival, they kind of see type 2 as a more evolved case of they kind of see type 2 as a more evolved case of type 1, which once again is not the case. Once I get done explaining this, you're going to see that type 1 and type 2 diabetes really shouldn't even be named in the same category. Diabetes should not be used for the same conditions because they're almost 180 degrees in difference as far as the actual condition itself. Type 1 diabetes is a autoimmune condition. Now, I'm not a type 1 diabetic specialist. That is not my area. It's not something that I've given a lot of my attention to as far as studying it and understanding it. So I won't pretend to be an expert on type 1 diabetes. I am an expert when it comes to type 2 diabetes. But with type 1 diabetes, as I understand it and the information that I've been given and then the basic information that I've researched, essentially type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune condition. This is something that the person was born with. And over time, their immune system has a dysfunctional response where it starts to kill off the insulin producing cells in the pancreas called the beta cells. It starts killing off those insulin producing cells, which leads to a decrease in insulin production to the point where their pancreas is producing very little insulin or no insulin at all. And of course, this is a problem because when that person is starting to eat, when they eat that food, insulin's one of insulin's jobs. Insulin has many jobs, but one of the jobs is to store nutrients, and it will store the glucose from the food. But when you don't have the insulin, you're not able to store the food, the nutrients the way you're supposed to store it. And so since the pancreas is not producing insulin or producing very little insulin, but not sufficient, and the person is eating, the body has to now go into survival mode, meaning that you now have a high blood sugar. And the blood sugar is just sitting in the bloodstream and it's not going into the cells. And so one of the things the body's going to start to do is it's going to start to send it to the kidneys to be filtered out through urine. And so this will cause a person to urinate a lot. Also, the person, usually a younger individual, so a child or a teenager or someone in their early 20s, they're usually diagnosed around this time. They'll also start to notice that it's very hard for them to gain weight, keep weight, and they keep losing weight. And so another thing that was found long time ago when they really started to name these terms, they would notice that wherever someone who is diabetic, type 1, will urinate at outside on the ground, there will also be a collection of ants around the urine as well. And that's because the sugar was literally in the urine. The glucose was literally in the urine. So it was sweet urine that the ants were attracted to, which was another telltale sign of being a type 1 diabetic. So the conditions are very different. You have a pancreas that is no longer producing sufficient amount of insulin. Because of this is a condition that can lead to death because they're literally they're malnourished. They're not getting the nourishment. Their cells are not able to actually absorb the glucose because the insulin is not there. So this is a condition where the person can actually die. Insulin in this case, exogenous insulin, meaning insulin that is injected into the body, is life-saving for these patients. Because since they're not actually producing insulin, and we know that to be the truth, you'll check their insulin levels, you'll check their C-peptide levels, and we'll be able to verify that they truly are not producing insulin, which is different in type 2. And so since they're truly not producing insulin, injecting insulin is a life-saving treatment that will help them live a healthy life as long as they do the other healthy principles, such as eating whole foods, water, staying away from processed foods. And so that is type 1. This is not something that you can actually, type 1 diabetes is not something that you actually brought on yourself. Although there are a lot of research that points to cow milk kind of being the trigger for those who are prone to type 1, and also vitamin D deficiency being the trigger for type 1 as well. But even in those cases, someone in the family lineage was also a type 1 diabetic. But that's type 1. Now we switch over to type 2. Type 2 diabetes is 95%, and 95% is the number they keep giving out. I'm going to go as far as to say 98%, 99%, but 95% to be conservative, all lifestyle. Type 2 diabetes is all lifestyle, meaning that there were certain habits that you had in your life that created this condition. And what I mean by that, to break it down even more, is that your eating habits, based on the type of foods that you were eating, were increasing your glucose so high that your pancreas had to secrete a lot of insulin to bring that glucose down. And because you were eating so frequently and the food was so high, this is something that was lasting the majority of the day. And so your insulin levels remained high for so long that you became resistant to insulin. Why? Because insulin is a hormone that is designed to be secreted in bursts. It's not designed to be a hormone that's just sustained throughout the day. It is a burst hormone, meaning that whenever insulin is secreted, its effects are designed to last for minutes versus hours, like many of us are living right now. And so the eating is going to keep the glucose up, which is going to keep the insulin up. The drinking is going to keep the glucose up, which is going to keep the insulin up. And people are doing this several times a day, 2 to 3 hours they're eating, 6 more meals they're eating. And once again, this is advice and recommendation that they were given based from their doctors, their healthcare providers, their dietitians, their trainers. They were given this information of eating every 2 to 3 hours, 6 times a day. And this is the perfect recipe to keep your insulin levels high, making you insulin dominant, which will ultimately make you insulin resistant. Insulin resistance is the platform, it is the foundation for type 2 diabetes, pre-diabetes, high cholesterol, obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure. It is the foundation. You take all of those conditions and they are sitting on the foundation of insulin resistance, meaning that without insulin resistance, these conditions for the most part don't exist. And so you need to be insulin resistant as a prerequisite to be a pre-diabetic or be a type 2 diabetic or to be hypertensive. In order to be these conditions, being being insulin resistant is a prerequisite. And I hope that makes sense. And if it doesn't make sense, we definitely have other videos for you to check out called Insulin Resistance Explained, which will go through and do a fantastic job of explaining just what insulin resistance is. So insulin resistance was brought onto your life based on your lifestyle habits, the eating, the drinking, but also the lack of movement. And so if you're not moving enough, then you're just not utilizing the nutrients that are in your cells, which is making it even harder to bring down those levels, which means your pancreas needs to secrete more insulin. Now, I hope you caught the fact that when I talked about type 1 diabetes, I talked about the pancreas not having the ability to secrete insulin. That is the key component. That is the key component. And so since in type 1, the pancreas is not secreting insulin, injecting insulin is a life-saving treatment. Over here in type 2, we are talking about the dominance of insulin, being insulin dominant, the abundance of insulin being secreted from the pancreas. But don't miss the fact that the pancreas is only doing what it's doing because we are doing what we're doing, which is eating constantly, drinking constantly, and not moving. Insulin is doing its job. The pancreas is doing its job. It's doing its job based on what we are telling it to do. Whether we know we're telling it to do it or not, this is what we're telling it to do. We're telling it to constantly secrete insulin. This is going to make us insulin dominant. But the big thing is that you have insulin. If you're a type 2 diabetic, you have insulin. Now, there's this myth about the pancreas burnout. And once again, in a large percentage of those cases, the pancreas is not burnt out. What's going on with the pancreas is that it has fat infiltration. You have a fatty pancreas. And because the fat has infiltrated the organ, the pancreas, just like any other organ that has fat infiltration, you're going to have a decrease in the function of that organ. So, type 1 diabetes, you don't have insulin. Therefore, injecting insulin can save your life. Type 2 diabetes, lifestyle, insulin dominance, you have insulin. So now, if you have insulin, but at the same time, you're being given medications to increase your insulin, such as the sulfonylureas, or you're actually injecting insulin, and I'm telling you being insulin dominant is a problem because you're going to increase your resistance to insulin, and it's going to become one of those perpetual cycles where if at one point 20 units of insulin was working, you're going to get to the point where you need 30 units, and then 40 units, and then 50 units, 60, 80, 100, 120, 200. I told you in the beginning, insulin is a storage hormone. Its job is to store nutrients, but in addition to it being a storage hormone, it will also inhibit lipolysis. Lipolysis is the breakdown of fat. And so if you're constantly eating and you're constantly injecting insulin to deal with your glucose, you know what else you're doing? You're gaining more weight and you're stopping the breakdown of fat, because based on the insulin, we're instructing our bodies to hold on to the fat and gain more fat. So this is something that should have been broken down to you in the beginning. No type 2 diabetic should be confused about type 1 versus type 2 if, in my opinion, the practitioner did their job. This is something that you should have known right off the bat. Yo, what's going on? This is Edward, and you have just watched a clip from my YouTube channel. If you want to see the full video, be sure to click the link in the description to watch the full video on my YouTube channel.